This episode was sponsored by our patrons: Anna M., Cindy Henderson, Catherine Vogel, Kim Hokinson, Julie Gray, Bree Smith, Robin Brown, Janelise Cannon, Heather McKinnon, Jamie Lang, Maria Sanchez, Valerie Jacobson, Jill Harrigan, Michaela Frew, Chantel Oliver, and Caitlin McTaggart.
Hi, Katie.
Hi, Olivia.
I have a very exciting story to tell you.
Oh, yay.
Martha Wilmot is on her way home to Ireland from Russia. It is 1808.
1808. Russia and Ireland. Okay. Wow.
Martha has been in Russia for 7 years, but tensions between Russia and England are growing increasingly higher.
Quite.
As Napoleon continues his
Aha.
unhinged romp across Europe.
Well, Russia and Britain were allies against Napoleon, were they not?
At the beginning.
Okay.
And then when it became clear to Russia that this whole opposing Napoleon thing was really going to slow down their sea trade, they switched sides and signed a treaty with Napoleon.
Oh, right.
Angering all of Western Europe.
Okay.
And while she has some very powerful protectors who really, really, really do not want her to leave, Martha's family has finally convinced her that it's probably time to get out, take the safe route, come back home for a while. That safe route also involves smuggling out a many 100-page manuscript.
Oh.
That will absolutely get her arrested.
What?
And have serious political implications for the Russian court, and possibly land her dearest friend in the world in extremely hot water if it is found.
Dang.
The guards at the border leaving Russia are extremely suspicious. They have heard rumors about this Irish lady and what she might be carrying out of the country. And she is detained and questioned and searched and questioned and searched and questioned for many days, searching for what they know she has.
Wow.
In the end, she becomes so anxious that they are eventually going to find this manuscript that she burns it and eventually is allowed to pass through the border to safety and the journey home. Except she's going to be shipwrecked on the way home. Because of course she is.
Uh-huh.
And in fact, she's going to be shipwrecked twice.
Oh my gosh.
She will eventually make it back to her family in one piece, sans this manuscript that she has dedicated many years of her life to, but relieved in the knowledge that there is at least one other copy, an earlier version of this manuscript that her sister Catherine managed to smuggle out a year earlier, before suspicion became quite so pointed about these sisters.
I'm trying to imagine what is in this manuscript. 1808 Russian manuscript.
Is it treaties? Is it political secret documents? Is it
Somebody's expose, yeah.
Is it the scandals of the Russian court?
The royal court. Yes.
Kind of. This manuscript is the memoir of the Princess Ekaterina Dashkova.
Okay.
Who is one of the most important and influential noblewomen in the court of Catherine the Great. And one of the most important and influential figures in the Russian Enlightenment.
Ah.
Scientific mathematical, literary, artistic circles. She is, other than Catherine the Great, maybe the queen bee of Russian fancy smart people.
Yeah, you see profiles of her on Instagram a lot, or like plucked out of history as one of the featured females of the Enlightenment.
Well, she certainly was.
Why, what was in her memoirs?
That's what everybody wanted to know.
Oh.
All of the Russian officials were very worried about what might be in this manuscript.
Oh. So it was just the fact that she wrote memoirs that they were
She was right in the center of some of the biggest and most politically explosive upheavals in Russian history. She may or may not have been one of the key figures in the installation of Catherine the Great, in the coup of Catherine the Great's husband, the Tsar. She knew everyone in every high-ranking Russian circle, and she had been there for all of it, all of the scandals, all of the political coups, all of the very, very exciting and potentially very damaging. Catherine the Great's son, who is currently in charge, knows that Princess Dashkova's memoir could reveal all kinds of things that he would not want out in the world. He's never seen it. He has no idea what's in it. But just on principle, this can't be allowed.
Okay.
And he knows that if anybody is going to be trusted with trying to take it out of the country to where it could perhaps be published, it will be Martha Wilmot. Famously, Princess Dashkova's protege, adopted daughter, super bestie forever.
What a weird twist. How did a Irish lady become the BFF of a Russian polyglot? How did that happen? I guess if they have royal connections, they're all connected to each other back then. It's just like all one giant royal family.
She very much does not. The Wilmot sisters are regular. They are solidly middle rank. They have some aristocratic friends and connections, but she is nobody special. And there's absolutely no reason to anticipate that Martha and Catherine Wilmot would end up the closest confidants of a Russian princess.
Fun.
How did this happen is the question that we are going to spend the next little while unraveling, and it is a fascinating ride.
And did the manuscript get published? Did they get it out?
It did.
Cool.
Eventually. Kind of.
Okay, great.
I'm Olivia Mickle.
And I'm Katie Nelson.
And this is What's Her Name?
Fascinating women you've never heard of.
I discovered this fascinating story thanks to a new book by Dr. Alexis Wolf.
My name is Dr. Alexis Wolf, and I research women's literary lives, especially in the 18th and 19th century. And I'm here to talk about Katherine and Martha Wilmot, who are the subjects of my new book, Transnational Women Writers in the Wilmot Coterie, 1798 to 1840, Beyond Borders and Boundaries, which was published in October 2024. Martha and Katherine Wilmot were two Irish sisters from the late 18th and early 19th century. And they were travelers, they were diary writers, they were editors, translators. They did really incredible things, but almost all under the radar in their day. They left behind this huge corpus of manuscript writing, commonplace books, diaries, journals, poetry, and travelogues. Recently, as there have been more scholarly attention that's been paid to their work, and especially due to their connection to Princess Ekaterina Dashkova, that they both traveled and lived with in Russia and helped her to write her memoir, which they then smuggled out of Russia back to England and then Ireland during the Anglo-Russian War.
let's rewind. Let's head back to County Cork, Ireland, where Katherine and Martha Wilmot, the daughters of a very respectable, fairly socially prominent, definitely not aristocratic family, are trying to figure out how they're going to launch out into the world. Katherine, through an amazing piece of good luck, has been invited to go to Paris with her aunt's good friend, Lady Mountcashel. Lady Mountcashel is a pretty prominent feminist icon at this time, had been a student of Mary Wollstonecraft, speaking of massive feminist icons. So before Mary Wollstonecraft became probably the most famous feminist radical writer in England and maybe the Western world, and eventually the mother of Mary Shelley, dying in childbirth, giving birth to her. Mary was working as a governess in Ireland as a young woman. Lady Mountcashel was her pupil. And as Mary Wollstonecraft became, a prominent writer, philosopher, thinker, Lady Mountcashel's thinking was very much aligned with Mary Wollstonecraft's views on women's equality, on the state of politics, on how the world should be.
And then she grew up to become a writer and sort of a secret radical herself, and ended up leaving her husband, leaving her family, and starting a new radical life in Italy later in life. So she was really influenced by Wollstonecraft and was involved in the Irish Revolution. But before she had done those kind of more overtly scandalous things, she was part of literary circles in Ireland. And she was very close with Katherine, the elder sister, and she brought Katherine with her when she traveled in Paris with her family.
Lord and Lady Mountcashel are doing the grand tour. Lady Mountcashel is bringing along sort of a little coterie of Irish women to keep her company on this trip. And she volunteers to take Katherine along.
So when I found this record, a journal that had been written by Katherine about her time traveling with Lady Mountcashel, I just fell down a rabbit hole, and so many more doors opened up. Discovered all of the things that she and Martha had done, and it was just pretty incredible.
And halfway through the grand tour, Lady Mountcashel decides she's done with her marriage. She's leaving her husband. She's not going back to Ireland.
Wow.
Scandalizes everybody. And Katherine Wilmot finds herself running in these really wild, radical circles in Paris at the height of this Enlightenment, feminist,
Blue stockings.
yeah, all of that.
Radical free thinking.
So Katherine had all of Wollstonecraft's connections, socializing with people like Thomas Paine and William Godwin, but not really telling her family about it.
The list of incredibly famous people that they are hanging out with would take a whole episode. Katherine is not exactly telling her family about all of these encounters. Her family's open-minded, but probably not this open-minded. And she doesn't really need her parents to find out that she is hanging out with Irish nationalists or religious revolutionaries or all of the eccentrics and wild child weirdos of European society. She is meeting and becoming quite close friends, much closer friends perhaps than she even writes down in her private diaries with a lot of these people.
And that's 3 years after the attempted Irish Revolution, 1798, which was like the Irish version of the American Revolution, but it failed. So everybody who was part of that movement had to flee Ireland and was on the continent. So
and Lady Mountcashel was very probably heavily involved in that attempt, actually.
If that's the circle she's moving with.
All the most radicals,
Yeah, the Enlightenment, cult of liberty, rebels.
And all
if
of
they're not
the
dead.
French revolutionaries who survived Napoleon's takeover. And all of the leftover American founding fathers who are bored with how America's just kind of carrying on and want some new excitement. Everyone is here. She's keeping a journal throughout this entire 2-year sojourn on the continent. It is a wild read. It is even published in a highly edited form after she gets back.
Catherine's travel log from Paris, where she hung out in the salon of Helen Maria Williams and did amazing things, was published in the 1920s in Ireland as being a tour relating the travels of Sir Mountcashel, of Lady Mountcashel's husband, who's only mentioned, I think, twice or something in the entire book.
That's what the publisher thought people would want, and so that's what they said it was.
Okay.
And eventually this book and Catherine's whole identity gets sort of back-engineered in literary circles and historians over the centuries to be the diary of Lady Mountcashel's maid.
Oh.
I think that mispackaging of their writing and the misunderstanding of them and the way that things are kind of mispackaged over time irritated me so deeply that I spent the last 12 years trying to publish other things that would show who they really were and what they were really doing.
She returns to Ireland eventually, but these connections she has built here have now linked her and her family to the European intellectual elites in ways that are going to change the entire family. Meanwhile, back home in Ireland, while Catherine is off gallivanting around Paris, her sister Martha is really struggling.
In 1802, Martha's favorite brother died while he was serving in the Navy in the West Indies, I believe, and he died of yellow fever. And Martha was extremely depressed. So at that time, there weren't a lot of cures for depression, but one of the best cures that was seen as a cure for depression was to travel.
I firmly agree, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Let's send them off to a beautiful
Spa town.
sanatorium in Switzerland.
Yes.
For, nothing extravagant. Maybe just a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that they can recover.
So did she get sent off to a spa town?
Normally, somebody would go to a warm climate, but because Catherine, the aunt, was very close with Martha, sort of suggested, well, you could go and see my friend, the Russian princess. Martha immediately was really kind of cheered up by this idea, and she was like, I would love to go to Russia. She just really wanted to go.
Russia seems an odd choice, maybe, for a middle-ranking, depressed Irish woman. But hey, if your aunt knows a princess, that's where you go.
Yeah. Well, that's what you got to do if you don't have independent means. You have to go stay with somebody so it's free.
Good point.
Take what you can get.
Yeah. So Aunt Catherine sends a letter, and Princess Dashkova sends an extremely effusive invitation. Absolutely, please send her. I would love to meet your niece. Martha's parents are not on board with this plan.
There was a lot of opposition on the part of Martha's parents and family. Her father didn't want to let her go. But Dashkova wrote a letter sort of saying that she would take good care of her and treat her as her own child.
The deluge of welcome from Princess Dashkova is just irresistible. She insists that she will take care of Martha. She will have the best protection a person could have in the patronage of Princess Dashkova. And so eventually, off she goes.
And she did kind of treat her as her own child. She invited her when she arrived to call her her Russian mother. She doted on her. She spent so much time and money and effort and love kind of educating and introducing Martha into society that actually Martha fell under a huge amount of suspicion from the people that were around Dashkova, including her daughter, who saw Martha as a huge threat.
So, who is Princess Ekaterina Dashkova? Well, she is an incredibly cool and fascinating person who I would absolutely want to go hang out with for a while.
Princess Dashkova was a really kind of divisive figure in Russia when the Wilmot sisters arrived. So she was an older woman. She was the head of her own estate. She had been part of the court of Catherine the Great, who is no longer alive. She had fallen out of favor for her supposed involvement in the coup that had sort of taken out Catherine's husband and put Catherine on the throne. Whether or not Dashkova really had any role in the coup is kind of questionable. She tells her own side of the story and said that she didn't really know what was going on, but that if she had, she would have done anything for Catherine, who, she sees as the most important person in the world.
She was also an intellectual force to be reckoned with, was incredibly well educated, but incredibly curious and interested in the world. She was obsessed with learning about the world, with finding out. She reminds me so much of Emily de Châtelet.
Yeah.
In that, what am I going to do with my life of privilege? I'm going to learn everything.
Yeah. And
I'm going to meet everyone who could teach me anything.
And then contribute to that pursuit of enlightenment, try to be a part of humanity waking up.
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, howdy did she contribute.
She was the first female head of an academy in, if you want to consider Russia as part of Europe, which she did at that time. She was the first head of an academy of arts and sciences. She was a real Enlightenment and Renaissance woman in her heyday. She wrote plays. She had a cabinet of natural curiosities and collected 3,000 items. She helped start a museum in Moscow. So she was a real kind of cultural bastion of her day. But by the time the Wilmots came, she was living kind of she called it an exile, but she was pretty comfortable, and she would still go to Moscow a lot of the time. But she had been exiled for a little while, which she was really upset about and really wanted to memorialize her suffering as well, because she saw that as kind of honoring Catherine.
She was a hugely passionate advocate for women's rights and women's education, loudly advocating for educational reforms and women's participation in intellectual life, in political life, in educational life in ways that were triply shocking in Russia, where the literacy rate for women was something like 10% as opposed to 40% at this point in Ireland.
The shorthand version is she's like Emily du Châtelet and Mary Wollstonecraft wrapped up in one person.
And Caroline Herschel and Hester Poulter and Margaret Cavendish. And
brilliant, both in literature and in science and math.
And music.
Yeah.
And art.
She's everything.
She's everything.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe that's why she wanted to go to Russia. You hear you can go be a companion to that lady? Heck yes, I'd travel halfway across the world to go hang out with her.
And they had already heard so many good things about her from their aunt, who just adored her.
So kind of earlier in the 18th century, Dashkova sort of had a brief falling out with Catherine the Great. Basically, Catherine kind of was like, I want you to go away for a while. And Dashkova used the opportunity to travel quite a lot. And she made two really close women friends. And one of them was Catherine Hamilton, who was the aunt of Katherine and Martha Wilmot. They formed a really intense friendship, and they traveled around together for a long period of time. And they stayed in touch, and they stayed really close. For Dashkova, these relationships with women were really, really important to her well-being. She was widowed and spent a long time unmarried. And so there was a long connection with the family. And the Wilmot sisters arrived kind of primed to think that she was really fascinating.
And Martha realizes very quickly after arriving that this woman's life is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
She was there for everything. She was the Forrest Gump of 18th century Russia. And she starts insisting that Princess Dashkova must write an autobiography. She must write these stories down. And the princess is very uninterested. She loves telling these stories, but she's not really interested in the idea of a memoir. But Martha will not let it go. She must preserve these stories of this amazing life for humanity.
But I think that Dashkova really kind of needed someone who loved her as much as Martha did and who saw her as important as she did. You know, this young, charming Irish woman arrived and was really interested in her life story and thought everything she had done politically and otherwise was incredibly important.
And this relationship becomes really close and really intense very quickly, which for the princess is pretty normal and just kind of how she operates, and is clearly patterned on her own relationship with Catherine the Great when she was the younger protege of this incredibly powerful woman. They had a sincere, real, emotional, close friendship, even though there was this massive power imbalance, right?
Well, that's a pretty classic relationship back then. Like, you can have close emotional relationships with people you have plucked from obscurity, whereas all your class peers are also threats, and there's too much drama there to actually be friends.
No.
So you pick your friends from obscurity, then they owe you everything, and that trust is there because you know that you have the power to make or ruin them.
Martha definitely felt that power imbalance and felt a huge debt. She loved the princess. She really genuinely was devoted to her, found her fascinating, was so grateful for all of this that she's been given, this access, this education, this travel, and just literally money. Like, the princess is sending her family gifts and money and helping her sister who's ill, making their lives so much easier. And she definitely feels the weight of that obligation in a way that the princess doesn't seem aware that Martha would be feeling. She doesn't seem to have understood how complicated this relationship may have been for Martha. And she definitely was used to getting her own way. Finally, Princess Dashkova says, okay, fine. I'll do it if you help me, and if you make sure it is not published until after I die.
Classic.
I think that she was quite eager to leave something behind as well. But she said that her love for Martha and her appreciation for Martha kind of moved her to do this.
And so this becomes sort of the great work of Martha's life, and then eventually, spoilers, Catherine's life, to help birth and shape and preserve this record of her patron, her best friend, her Russian mother, her life. And it takes up decades of her life, this project.
And I think one of the most wonderful things about this story is just that you have these two women who they did receive probably a relatively good education for middle-ranking women of their day, but they wouldn't have been, you know, formally educated in the way the boys of their time would have been. And they didn't have languages, but they were very, very clever and they were very tenacious. And they're suddenly given access to this really incredible historical project that they're essentially helping to guide. And then on top of that, they're given access to the archive of this woman who's lived this really, really extensive life. Like, she was a member of the American Philosophical Society. She corresponded with Benjamin Franklin. She was everywhere and had this incredible impact on culture in the mid to late 18th century. So they're suddenly sifting through her papers and picking what would be important to include in this volume that they one day hope will be published. They're hand copying and transcribing letters from Catherine the Great and teaching themselves French so that they can read the French that was the diplomatic language in Russia at the time, and translating these letters and collecting them, making multiple copies, and trying to strategize how they'll get them out of Russia and bring them home and keep them safe.
And not speaking French in any society center in Europe in 1803 is really embarrassing. And it's a major social hurdle for her. And she is mortified by it. And yet, she continually puts herself out there to do these things that are so important to her. She is insisting on helping the princess write this memoir in French, and then she's going to translate it into English. But she's also translating letters from Catherine the Great, doing all of this sort of archival work around the life of the princess that is really difficult for her and that publicly exposes over and over again her most embarrassing limitations and highlights that she is an outsider. And she does it anyway. She throws her ego to the side and does it anyway.
So this becomes a project where they start also sending things back home to their relatives in Ireland. They had a lot more sisters as well, and they had a mother who was really interested in this. And these women who never traveled became a part of this project as well by copying things and saving things. So it becomes this kind of network, and it connects women across different social classes, across different countries, but also across time, because you have the ill sister of Martha and Catherine who's working on something that was written by Catherine the Great. So it's this really wonderful, wonderful network that's going on.
When Martha's family started pushing hard for her to come home, she begs Martha not to leave. She exerts all of her emotional pressure to keep Martha there. It gets so difficult for Martha's family that they eventually send Catherine to Russia to extract Martha and bring her home.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, instead, Catherine gets sucked in to the magnetic attraction of Princess Dashkova.
That's right.
And ends up staying for 2 years.
I would too.
And this is why I love the Wilmot sisters, because they are handed luxury on a platter. They could do literally nothing. They could spend all of their time in parties, salons, meeting all of the famous people, and just be ladies of pampered luxury for the rest of their lives.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, the sisters chose to do stuff.
Because this is the Enlightenment. Learn, grow, do.
Yeah, and they are definitely living the correct spirit of the age here.
Correct.
They do valuable, interesting, intellectually difficult work that requires them to step out of their comfort zones, expose their weaknesses, and pay attention to the world around them in ways that people had not been paying attention. Not just forcing Princess Dashkova to write her memoirs and record all of this very important stuff that they really see as being incredibly important to preserve. They're using their kind of outsider status to notice things that are normal to everyone around them and go, well, that's interesting, that's weird, why are we doing that?
Being the guest of Princess Dashkova and living on her country estate, the Wilmots were reading a lot of pretty highbrow literature at the time in various different languages they were trying to teach themselves. And they were aware of what we would think of now as sort of anthropology, early ethnography. You see them thinking, oh, I could do a bit of that myself. And I'm in a position where I could do that. Some of the most interesting things in the archival material are Russian folk songs that they would go out and they would listen to the people singing them that were living on Dashkova's estate.
They are writing down folk songs in their very still broken Russian and then translating them into English to send home. Often, all we have left is their English translation of the folk songs that they have documented. So music historians are taking those very rough, sometimes English translations, especially from the early years, and having to sort of identify, oh, this is probably this Russian folk song. But there are a few songs that they wrote about that nobody knows what they are. This is the only record of these folk songs from the countryside peasants around Princess Dashkova's villa. They're doing proto-anthropology and ethnology and linguistic studies and musicology and frantically documenting everything they can find. And they're using the fact that they're women to get access to cultural artifacts that no men have ever had access to.
They would go to the bathhouse and watch the rituals they were doing before certain young women were married.
What do the women do before a girl gets married? What do they do before a childbirth? What are the processes? What are the rituals? What are the beliefs?
Cool.
And they're recording all of that in as much detail and with an absolutely kind of open-minded and enthusiastic spirit of inquiry that is the opposite of what all of the Victorian anthropologists who will come after them will do. And it's delightful.
They documented these practices and then they translated them and they kept them. And then these things were circulated. And when they came home, they would sort of perform these things at parties that they would share and tell these stories. So I think it's really interesting to see the ways that they were participating in international dialogues, but kind of in letters and diaries and private ways that were acceptable for women to do at the time. And I mean, it's colonialism too, isn't it? Because they're sort of like coming in doing these things. However, it's very interesting that they chose this as their focus of study.
Which is just also so meta to me now. These women who've been completely forgotten were dedicating all of their hours to making sure that these very forgotten women, the peasant women, the lowest of the women in this society around them, would not be forgotten. These women's lives matter, and they are as worthy of the dignity of documentation of publishing as the life of the princess or of science or math or literature or philosophy. They deserve the same level of attention and study as any other subject. And I love that.
They were doing these practices that probably Dashkova was encouraging, but they were doing them themselves. And they were doing it for their own knowledge and their own benefit and to share them with people in their circle and men and women that they knew at home and tell them about their experience. It's really interesting because women at the time were excluded from institutions where this kind of work was being done. Women could join institutions in their home country like the Royal Irish Academy, although funnily Dashkova was an honorary member. But she was, I think, one of the only women that was. And she never attended because she lived in Russia. It's a really exciting kind of story of women doing these really interesting things at a time when women are seen as not doing that many interesting things if they didn't have means to do them. There's a story of networks and friendship between women that was sometimes very, very intense and a lot of expectations of reciprocation, and especially from women like Princess Dashkova, who would take on, Martha Wilmot as a kind of protege and then expected her to stay with her. And then you have these emotional scenes for leaving.
When Martha leaves in 1808, she absolutely intends to come back and live with Princess Dashkova again at some point after this silly Anglo-Russian war works itself out. It's hard to know exactly how she felt about leaving. Her family was very, very desperate for her to be back. She was carrying this burden of obligation-based relationship, but also just truly loved Princess Dashkova.
When Dashkova dies in 1810, she's really heartbroken that her friend has died. But her death actually kind of gives Martha an opportunity to start her life, because she's not thinking, maybe I should go back to Dashkova. She had thought that possibly after the Napoleonic Wars, she might return to Russia and live with her again. So then Martha begins the process of trying to edit the memoirs and quickly discovers that there are some pretty glaring problems. It's written in French and she doesn't feel capable of translating it. Catherine attempted a translation, but it wasn't particularly good. Martha ends up getting married in the 1810s, and luckily her husband, the translator. And although this is only really made evident through the archival material that I reveal in the book, he translates the manuscript. And then they come up against really strong opposition from Dashkova's brother, who was the former Russian ambassador to England.
He hears this is happening and says, absolutely not. What are you doing?
Oh.
You can't publish this. We don't know what's in there. You could destroy her reputation. You could destroy my reputation. Also, he very cleverly says, how do we even know this is real? This could just be something that you just made up. And he tells them they need to wait for 30 years.
Till he's dead.
Till he's dead, maybe.
So Martha's really heartbroken because she spent the greater part of a decade working on this project for her friend. But really, it's also Martha's sort of, I don't want to say it's her claim to fame because that's not what she was looking for, but it's her life's literary work, if you could say it that way. It's the thing that she's devoted herself to doing with all of her time for quite a long time. But she does end up putting it aside for quite a long period of time. And it's only published in 1840. When it comes out, it's very successful. She publishes it with a good publisher as well at the time. And it's read by people like Maria Edgeworth, who write Martha letters saying how much they appreciated it. And it was a massive 2-volume biography, not just the memoir itself that Princess Dashkova had written about her life. So I think it is true that their greatest achievement, and they saw it this way as well. The most miraculous thing about it is that not only is it beautifully presented by Martha and with her husband silently helping her, which I think is really wonderful and kind of a testament of love that for once the man is silent. It has these supplements in the back, which are a huge range of her kind of letters exchanged with Catherine the Great, with people like Voltaire, but also about 100-something pages of the Wilmots' own writing in their travelogues. And she had given them permission to do that. Catherine is no longer alive by this point, so Martha collects her letters and edits them together for her into a narrative. But Martha writes a completely independent travelogue, and it's about 90 pages long. And half of it is about Dashkova, and half of it is just about her journeys and her adventures on the way home. So she gets to see herself in print beyond just being the editor, but she's all over the book. Her relationship with Dashkova is the kind of seam that holds the book together. When I was first researching this period in my master's studies, I was really interested in looking at archives of women's writing, the idea of networks and the way that there's a knock-on effect of women influencing each other in the period. And I remember trying to see some of Mary Wollstonecraft's letters in the British Library. They laughed at me. They were like, there's no reason for you to see them. And then I wrote to the Royal Irish Academy, and I was like, I would love to see the letters of the Wilmot sisters. Is that allowed? And they were like, oh, please come see them.
And she was able to see all of it because nobody cares about them.
That's why sometimes you see accusations of people intentionally leaving minor characters out of the story or intentionally ignoring women. But
The people working in the field, the historians, the archivists, are trying to get people to pay attention to them and use them. It's not a conspiracy of hiding the sources.
Yeah.
It's an ignorance of the sources on the whole. Or people saying, if you want to write a best-selling book, you better write it about somebody famous.
Yep. Which is often true.
If you write it about obscure people, nobody will read it.
But if you write a book that explicitly tells you that it's about 80 lost women, sometimes people really like it, and it does well.
Sometimes.
The book is really a work of archival detective work. What were they really doing, and why did certain things end up in certain archives, and what were they trying to hide? Also, what didn't they want to be preserved? Katherine Wilmot's Parisian journal, actually, is a really interesting one. In the course of my research, I found in a private family collection in Scotland, there was her original journal on which the later journal was based. And it's very, very different. It talks about her spending more time with all of these radicals in Paris and doing things that she probably wouldn't want her family to know. Martha, who was much more conservative, outlived Katherine, and there are things that I wonder where they went or what actually happened, because Martha edited quite a lot of the archive before donating it. There's some references to a romance that there's just like a scrap of that's left over that's like, I feel it, and I wish that I could not, but I still do, that kind of thing. So I wonder who else has been cut out and what else Katherine was actually up to. I think the stature of the forgotten women versus, the people who have lots of books written about them is really interesting. But there are so many other stories that are waiting that need to be put together.
Obviously that's one of the things that spurred us to start this podcast in the first place. What if there were, in fact, more than 6 women in the history of the world who did something worth talking about?
Wouldn't that be interesting?
I mean, obviously, this is not specific to women's history. It happens all the time. How many books do we need about Winston Churchill? But it does seem to happen more to women, and it's incredibly frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
It also, as Alexis Wolf points out, offers pretty huge advantages for scholars who are interested in working on new stuff. So, we end with 2 pieces of advice from and about the Wilmots' lives, I think. If anyone offers you a chance to go live with a Russian princess, say yes. And if you're a young academic wishing that you could work on something no one else has ever written about, instead of writing the 98th dissertation this year about insert famous person here, work on women.
Try women's history.
There's so many out there.
It's wonderful. It really is lucky. I mean, it's a great field to be in right now.
I don't think that I know for a fact that people who are not scholars, and possibly people who don't live in Ireland, have no sense of who they are and the amazing things that they achieve. And I was hoping with this book that I could change that a bit. The 2 of them are, like many of the women on this podcast, just completely remarkable and deserve a lot of attention. A lot more than even I could ever give them in my lifetime.
Huge thanks to our guest, Alexis Wolf. On our website at What'sHerNamePodcast.com, you'll find links to her book, photos, resources, and more. There you can become a patron of the podcast for as little as $1 a month and help support future episodes.
You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where we post lots of photos each week.
Music provided by Lidija Ruslanova,
Katie Davis Henderson,
Komon, Tatyana Kalmokova, and Amanda Setlik Wilson.
Our theme song was composed and performed by Daniel Foster Smith.
Our intern is Katie Boucher. What's Her Name is produced by Olivia Mickle and Katie Nelson, and this episode was edited by Olivia Mickle.